Welcome to The Explainer. Listen, today we're unpacking a massive, literally massive, trend that has absolutely hijacked the digital asset space over the last couple of days. So, according to the source material, there's a record amount of people out there right now actively selling their XRP holdings just to chase XLM. And hey, if you've been watching the charts, you've for sure seen the exact price action causing this absolute panic. But the real question is that actually a wise move? Today we're breaking down a really fascinating analysis that compares the historical chart trends of both these assets just to see what the data is actually trying to tell us.
Okay, let's dive right into this because, well, this is the elephant in the room. A ton of investors are watching XLM just pump right now, and they're feeling that emotional pull of FOMO, the fear of missing out. And they're asking themselves, wait, should I swap my XRP for XLM? Is XLM going to win the race? And look, it's a totally natural reaction. When you see big green candles on one side of the fence and just, stagnation on the other, it messes with your head. But acting on that short-term emotion, that might just be a textbook example of missing the forest for the trees.
Which brings us to part one, the XLM FOMO phenomenon.
So right now, there's this narrative floating around. The capital is leaving traditional crypto projects to chase these crazy fast, short-term gains in prediction markets, meme coins, or really just whatever the hot asset of the week happens to be. The market is acting super nascent and, frankly, completely irrational right now. People are basically jumping from casino to casino, and that micro-level noise is really clouding the macro-level reality of what's actually being built behind the scenes. And this brings us to a super crucial concept, the investment thesis. Think about the really early investors in companies like Tesla or Nvidia. Those companies didn't turn into global titans because day traders were gambling on them. No, they became titans because they were delivering on incredible tech that the rest of the world just hadn't quite grasped yet. And then, boom, suddenly it was way too obvious to ignore. That's what it actually means to have a thesis. It's about accumulating an asset before the rest of the world figures out the massive value that you already see, instead of just playing a guessing game with a line on a chart.
And to show you just how confused the market actually is right now, there's this incredible anecdote from the source material. Get this. Rand Neuner, obviously one of the biggest personalities in crypto, had legendary trader Peter Brandt on his show. So Rand asks him, "Peter, what is your favorite pick right now?" And Peter's answer? XRP. Rand was absolutely floored, mainly because he's known for being super critical of XRP, while reportedly holding a bag of over 80 much smaller, totally unproven projects himself. This exchange just perfectly hits the nail on the head. When even the biggest social media personalities can't recognize an asset that's literally custom-built for massive institutional adoption, it just proves how immature the market still is. The real alpha is planting your flag way before these titans finally catch on.
Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 2, Historical Chart Trends Compared.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that if we want to separate all that short-term noise from actual reality, we have to pull back and look at the last 10 to 12 years. And when you do that, a super clear pattern emerges. If you look at XLM's behavior, yeah, it definitely has these really short, rare blips where it briefly outperforms XRP. But over the long haul, its chart basically mimics XRP. Then you look at XRP's history. For the vast majority of its existence, XRP has heavily outperformed XLM. The analysis notes that when these macro moves happen, historically, XRP makes a very similar move to XLM, but with way more upside volatility. And here's the crucial part. It actually holds on to those gains for a much longer period of time. So if you're thinking about swapping XRP for XLM right now, you're essentially betting against a solid decade of historical market behavior. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if we want to separate all that short-term noise from actual reality, we have to pull back and look at the last 10 to 12 years. And when you do that, a super clear pattern emerges. If you look at XLM's behavior, yeah, it definitely has these really short, rare blips where it briefly outperforms XRP. But over the long haul, its chart basically mimics XRP. Then you look at XRP's history. For the vast majority of its existence, XRP has heavily outperformed XLM. The analysis notes that when these macro moves happen, historically, XRP makes a very similar move to XLM, but with way more upside volatility. And here's the crucial part. It actually holds on to those gains for a much longer period of time. So if you're thinking about swapping XRP for XLM right now, you're essentially betting against a solid decade of historical market behavior.
But wait, what about the recent news, right? A huge chunk of this current XLM pump is actually being fueled by an announcement about a patent from the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. A lot of people are totally buying into this narrative that XLM was somehow chosen. But our source clarifies a really important fact about that DTCC patent. It actually lists both XLM and XRP. Look, Stellar got an absolutely fantastic marketing bump from this, which is great for XLM holders for sure. But if this one single marketing announcement is enough to make you abandon your entire XRP thesis, well then you probably need to step back and reevaluate how strongly you actually believed in that thesis in the first place.
Which perfectly sets up Section 3, the Google versus Bing analogy.
This analogy is just spot on when explaining why XRP has historically commanded a much larger market presence and just outpaced XLM over the long run. Basically, both the XRP ledger and the Stellar network are chasing the exact same massive goal, right? Institutional settlement. The source compares XRP to Google and XLM to Bing. Now, let's be clear, this is not a knock on Stellar. Bing was wildly successful in the early days of the internet. Actually, an early investment in Bing would have paid off massively. But Bing never achieved that massive, absolutely undeniable global footprint that Google did. The thesis here is that XRP is the network fundamentally positioned for that Google-level worldwide institutional adoption.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the research concludes that XRP just has, quote, more meat on the bone. It's not just about having a fast ledger. It's about the massive surrounding enterprise infrastructure they're building out. I mean, think about it. First, you have Ripple custody securing the actual assets. Then you've got a dedicated global payment platform. On top of that, add in the upcoming stablecoin that's going to provide incredible deep liquidity. And finally, you wrap it all up with prime brokerage services. These are not just fancy buzzwords. These are the heavy-hitting, specific institutional tools designed to capture mass adoption on a global scale. These are massive ecosystem advantages that Stellar just, frankly, does not have right now. And that fundamentally justifies why XRP has historically held on to a much stronger market position.
All right, Section 4, the long-term outlook. So zooming back out to the macro perspective here, what does all of this actually mean for you? The investor who's sitting there trying to decide between these two assets today. How do these markets actually mature over time? Well, the timeline basically breaks down like this. In the present, right now, we are dealing with extreme market irrationality. People are totally chart chasing, trying to perfectly time these short-term XLM pumps. And historically speaking, those are the folks who end up getting completely washed out. Moving into the near future, we're going to hit a major inflection point where the industry titans finally wake up and recognize the long-term institutional alpha that's already been built. And then finally, in the long term, the market naturally corrects itself because ultimately the market simply cannot ignore mass adoption and real tangible utility. And that leads to mass price appreciation for the fundamentally superior asset. Which leaves us with one final super critical question from the analysis. Are you just trading a short-term line on a chart, literally jumping at every single green candle you see? Or are you truly investing in an asset that is fundamentally positioned for long-term global adoption? The thesis here firmly concludes that, historically speaking, XRP is the single most resilient asset in the entire crypto space, outside of maybe Bitcoin when it comes to actually holding its gains over time. Sticking to a really solid, well-researched thesis, rather than just falling for whatever the FOMO of the week is, that is historically how the absolute biggest rewards are reaped. It's definitely something to seriously think about before you make your next move. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and remember, keep your eyes on the big picture.